everybody. Before we go into our slideshow, I wanted to big screen say hello and introduce ourselves. I am Alex Ertl. I am the outgoing program director for the Trauma, Stress, and Resilience program here at UCBT. I've been a psychologist for about 10 years, and I'm also toward the latter end of a 160-hour training program for psilocybin-assisted therapy. And I just want to do a quick shout out for anyone who's worried joining us from Colorado. As a social worker, we have gotten the CE approved for social work credit. So I just want to say that real quickly before anyone starts breaking out. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi, and I'm Michelle Ertl. I am a psychologist working currently in private practice in Colorado. And I have been working in psilocybin-assisted therapy since the beginning of these services being rolled out in Colorado, which we'll talk about is very, very new. So we're still, navigating a lot, working a lot on, providing the best services that we can, but it's still kind of a program in process. And I'm collaborating with UCBT's Colorado location on providing services with licensed healing centers in Colorado. So if you have a client who is potentially interested, they can go to UCBT's website to initiate a free consult as we're continuing to figure out ways to offer these services at licensed healing centers in Colorado. All right, so yeah, you're here from magic mushrooms to medicine, what clinicians should know about psilocybin-assisted therapy. And yeah, we're really excited about this topic. Yeah, we're both really passionate about this and the services that are now being offered. And we're excited that it seems like we have a lot of people from Utah, also a lot from Colorado and from other states as well who might be interested in kind of the direction of these services. Looking at, I need this one to play. We get a lot of different screens to navigate the chat and things like that. So appreciation for any odd technical difficulties that show up. Here's our overview for today. We have a lot of content that we're wanting to cover. So we're going to do our best to try to, fit everything in and have this be really valuable. But there's just, a lot going on within kind of the background history of this work, the research, and also kind of how these services actually play out in practice. So we are going to give a bit of that history lesson to have some contextual understanding of these services and these practices, discuss some of the mechanisms of action. We're going to go into some decent depth for kind of like the actual basic model and the structure of these services, so that if you do refer a client for these services, that you have at least some sort of a understanding of what their experience might be. We'll do at least a quick kind of review on application or applicability to populations and research overview. We're mostly going to be centering in on the research for depression, because that has the most kind of robust background of research at this time. And then talking about, for you as clinicians, if you might be referring your clients, what would your role be in this process, and hopefully wrapping up with a case study. Okay.
Alrighty. So now what you came for, I'm going to read to you verbatim from a slide, only because this is critically important and I want to be really precise with this so we can all read together. While academic and professional research has for decades investigated the effects of psychedelics broadly and psilocybin specifically, the existing body of research and conclusions is less extensive compared to other traditional psychotherapies. The presenters, us, will present findings and acknowledge where these findings are tentative or early in development. Treatment using this approach is still federally illegal, underlined, still federally illegal, and additional specialized training and licensure is required to complete this treatment with patients. Therefore, this presentation is for informational purposes only. Repeated, informational purposes only, and does not train attendees to use this approach with patients, and clinicians are not encouraged to utilize psychedelic substances with their clients outside state-specific legal models. Repeated, don't give your patients drugs. Utilization of psilocybin with clients outside of the state-specific legal model may result in harm to the client, the clinician, and the psychedelic movement at large. I just want to cover a couple things. There's no known conflicts of interest today and no outside commercial support for today. Do want to keep with APA guidelines on AI use disclosure. AI was used to help generate some images and graphics for today and assist with some visual formatting, and it will be noted where that was used. So, even though we can't see you as presenters right now, I do actually want to open up and get a little bit of an idea of how familiar. Oh, this is Michelle's slide. You're watching us live. It's live, folks.
Yeah, we're just kind of wanting to get a sense, of who we're presenting to. And what your kind of like level of understanding and familiarity is with this. So if you wouldn't mind, quickly just putting ABC in the chat for us to be able to just get a sense of, kind of like what level of familiarity. Lots and lots of B's. Okay.
The B's have it exclusively.
Okay, well, this is great.
One C, one A, a couple C's.
So some new to you. Yeah, a couple of A's there. But yeah, so hopefully this should be great to where that hopefully you can walk away with this with a deeper understanding of this model. It is, we're hoping that this starts rolling out to more and more states and becomes like more available to people. So not only being able to see, if this might be a fit for your clients to refer, or, if potentially in the future you're interested in getting trained in this model yourself.
Okay, cool. This is great seeing some responses. Gives confirmation that our internet just didn't disconnect and we're sitting here 2 hours. Yeah, talking to nobody.
Okay. Yeah, so some disclaimers again, as Alex mentioned, this is federally illegal. So there are, some like facets within that. We're going to talk about some do's and don'ts about whether you can technically like recommend this treatment to your clients because it is like federally illegal. So there are just a lot of nuances on being able to provide these services. We will be talking about the services in Colorado, which do have legal protection. So there can be a lot of like benefits for being able to operate within and provide these services in a legal context. With that discussion, being hopeful that future FDA approval will change this. That Compass Pathways, so they recently released results from their phase 3 FDA trials for treatment-resistant depression. So there is some, hope and anticipation that they might be the first company that will be moving forward with having formal FDA approval. Like in this process, there was a hiccup that came up recently where there had been some hope for MDMA-assisted therapy to receive FDA approval, and that didn't go through, which we can talk a little bit more about later on. One thing that is interesting to note, though, is that right now, like with these studies with Compass Pathways and with a lot of other of like the research studies, they are using synthetic psilocybin, that there is a belief that it is like, creating similar effects and similar like benefits, but it is using synthetic psilocybin. Whereas in Colorado, this treatment was approved under what's called the Natural Medicine Act. So we are using natural psilocybin. So it is actual naturally grown mushrooms. And the centers that I work at only use actual like whole mushrooms, no, not anything of like gummies or things that have been like manufactured. So there, can potentially be some difference when we are like comparing kind of these natural medicines and the effects compared to recognizing that research is primarily focusing on synthetics. Also of note that oftentimes there can be some questions around like microdosing and things like that. While technically in Colorado, microdosing can be done in certain like circumstances, there are some centers that are utilizing things like microdosing and having a breathwork ceremony, microdosing in art therapy or yoga, things like that. What we're going to be talking about here is what is called like a macrodose or like a journey experience. So we're going to be talking about these higher level doses and not really diving as much into the idea of microdosing. Again, there's a lot of questions that clients are having around microdosing. Some are using microdosing to like replace SSRIs, things like that. But we won't be talking about that here today, in part because there like really isn't a whole lot of research yet into microdosing. And there still are some questions around the safety surrounding long-term microdosing. And again, we are going to be primarily focusing on the Colorado model today because that's the model that I am working in and that Alex is like training in. So a lot of the like primary like tenets and like the actual kind of like approach within this is very similar within like other states, but there are just some like slight caveats. We try to note those where possible, but there are some slight differences. So Colorado, I mean, Oregon does have a model of access. They have been doing this longer than Colorado. We're trying to learn from the Oregon model a lot. And then in New Mexico, they passed legislation, but it isn't yet up and running. And they were the first state that actually passed legislation. I mean, passed this via legislation, whereas Oregon and Colorado passed via ballot measure. And so there are some benefits of like being able to see it being actually passed through formal legislation for some like greater support. But that also is creating some more barriers potentially because I believe they are going to be requiring a formal mental health diagnosis to access these services, whereas in Oregon and Colorado, that isn't a requirement. And lots of other states have pending legislation. So there definitely is an effort to roll this out into more states. And for all of our Utah people, Utah House Bill 390 was recently approved to go to the House floor to allow greater access for conducting research in the state. So it's still like primarily as a bill for opening up access to research and having these services available at like universities and hospitals conducting research.
To go into disclaimers, and this will feed into a little bit of a later conversation around history and context. There's sort of this dialectic that we're kind of talking about this as a new thing. It's like cutting edge, and also this has been something that has existed in the world for about 7,000 years. So we as psychologists are sort of the odd ones out, a little late to the game here in utilizing psilocybin or other psychedelics toward healing or growth. So I want to be really specific in naming like this is one context and one lens that we're looking through. And if we were different kinds of practitioners or in different cultures or different countries, we might be talking about this in a very different way. So I do want to name it like this is a westernized, Americanized, medicalized understanding of this. And there is sort of this kind of balance and tension of kind of remaining within the sort of medicalized system because there's kind of some pros to it with also like recognizing like this has been used within indigenous and ancient cultures for thousands of years and there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom to be gained by that. So I just kind of want to name like, the emphasis here within the psychological model is emphasis on symptom reduction, understanding change via physiology. This is taking place mainly within a capitalistic system and in sort of the downstream effects of colonization. So just as a brief contrast, there's other cultures that view illness and the use of psilocybin more from the realm of like, my illness or life problems are caused by some sort of disruption with my ancestors. Like maybe I've upset a previous ancestor of mine, and psilocybin is used in a ceremonial context to help communicate with that ancestor so that I can change my behaviors and then have positive downstream effects from there. So I want to just name all of this so that we stay humble. We want to seek to hold this point of view as a version of the truth, but don't want to hold it above the truth of others' cultures who have used this in a different way. Because there's pros and cons, right? Like in this medicalized system, there's a really strong emphasis and awareness on like safety and consent, but there's cons as well of like we're not able in the same way to assist with like spiritual crisis. Or for instance, there's not a sense of this as being embedded within a community. Often people are seeking these services and it might be only a handful of people in their lives know about it compared to cultures where this is more embedded and you might actually be utilizing this medication or the medicine or the mushrooms in a way it's like your family is actually present and your community understands what you're going through. So just want to notice that.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to ever mention a question, but we'll do it. Yeah, I see a great question that I want to respond to. We're going to do a noticing exercise first, and that did bring up for me that I did forget to mention. Yeah, that we do have like the Q&A as each of us are kind of like talking. We are going to be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. So we are planning on leaving some time at the end for Q&A, but we also will try as best as we can to be addressing questions as they arise.
Yeah. We got a lot to cover, so we'll see how much time there actually is there. Okay, so with all this, I want to do an exercise, and I'm going to present a couple of words on the screen. And I want you to notice what arises within yourself when you see these words. What images, what associations, what feelings come up for you? Because we're all coming into this with our own sort of personal and collective histories here. So I want to kind of start this from a place of noticing these internal frameworks and biases. So I'm going to put a word on the screen and just notice, don't type it into the chat or anything, just notice what comes up in you. So the word psychedelics. What associations, images, thoughts, feelings come up for you? Just noticing yourself. And psilocybin. What do you notice in yourself in reaction to this word? I'd be curious, do you associate either or both of these words with something that maybe looks somewhat like this? Is it associated with something more like this? What about this? Pictures of the actual mushroom. For how many of you, and considering how many of your potential clients or other people in the community, how many people thought of this, which is more of the kind of typical context that we're talking about here and what this sort of looks like in practice? So actually, do you want to hear a little bit? Will you please put in the chat just 1 to 3 words so I can kind of read them out loud? What came to mind for all of you? Curiosity, excitement, healing, release, healing, peace, connection. Oh, great. Mind opening nature.
Nice.
Yeah, Ram Dass, hippie, 70s, hippies, the
White
White
Rabbit.
Rabbit, Grateful Dead, cool, mushrooms, healing, visuals.
Lumps.
Yeah.
Yeah, unease, crazy
Oh,
partying.
chill, fun, relaxing. Timothy Leary, someone is going to like this history lesson. Bad trip, good trip, therapeutic option. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, so what we can hear just within the audience here, there's a wide range of reactions. And we want to be able to kind of check in, just like what are our internal or unconscious biases or reactions around this, to open up some room to talk to our clients and be more open to what these have to offer. Oh, I do want to, boy, it's 10:20 already. I'm gonna do a brief history lesson because I really do believe like the context here matters. So I want to go through a bit of the collective context that if you're kind of joining in from the States, of kind of where we're coming from, and kind of think about this in time. So through findings of artifacts and other archaeology, we recognize like somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 years, there has been use of psychedelic mushrooms with the human population. Psilocybin grows in pretty much every continent other than Antarctica. So it's something that has existed worldwide and has shown up in so many different aspects. So we're kind of thinking of this, and there's kind of an agreed upon, loosely defined 5 waves of psychedelics. So not just psilocybin, but psychedelics as a whole. That first wave being that sort of like old ancient times to about 1800. Then 1800s to 1950s is this period of early scientific research. Third wave includes the 1960s, so about 80s, and this is where the counterculture really takes up psychedelics. And then there's the corresponding reaction of prohibition. And then late 1990s to 2010s, where there's a psychedelic renaissance where research reemerges. And 2020s through today, it has become kind of mainstream. It has something that venture capitalists are interested in, and pharmaceutical companies are looking into this, and there's a movement of decriminalization. Something that I've heard that kind of like captures the spirit of it is like mushrooms are the new avocado toast. Like they're kind of trendy and opening up, and just kind of really want to name like why are we as like psychologists here in 2026 giving an introductory lesson to this, and because there's been so much kind of history and baggage with around this. Honing in a little bit on our context here of like how did this get introduced to our culture and population. I just want to go through real quickly because I could like each one of these lines is worthy of a 2-hour CE on its own. So in Central and North America, there was pretty widespread use of psilocybin. by ancient cultures. And then the Spanish Catholics arrived somewhere in the 1500s, and there is this really strong suppression of psilocybin. So largely, psilocybin use gets driven out and only exists on sort of like the fringes. So cultures or tribes or peoples that are maybe located in more mountainous, remote locations still kind of keep practices alive. I've heard of like more nomadic peoples who are keeping the traditions alive, but largely like the Spanish Catholic Church is pretty successful in squashing psilocybin use. One of these places that it was existing somewhat mostly in secrecy is in this area of Oaxaca, Mexico. And there's this woman who we can maybe use the term like medicine woman or wise woman, Maria Sabina, who's engaging with this with her local culture. And there's a businessman named R. Gordon Wasson who becomes the first Westerner to participate in a ceremony of velada with Maria. Kind of goes a bit to Mexico. It's very curious, goes under false pretenses. Stemming from that, in 1957, a Life magazine article was published. It actually is the first time the term magic mushrooms is used, and it sort of proliferates in the American awareness from there. In 1958, psilocybin is isolated as a molecule. So this is sort of like late 50s, like psilocybin is now being discovered by the West. An unfortunate outcome of this is there is this huge increase in psychedelic tourism to Maria Sabina's town. The town is sort of like overrun, and its culture is essentially destroyed. Maria has this really sad story of essentially being villainized and demonized and dies penniless and really like as almost like a hated figure in her local culture. Um, so back in stateside, we now kind of have this period where psilocybin, and it's also showing up at the time with LSD. It sort of like escapes the laboratory in the sense of like it was beginning to be explored in research, but now it's becoming something widely used and associated with counterculture movements, with hippie movements. We saw hippie come up so many times in the chat. So, we've got this very strong movement where it goes from like zero to very quickly proliferating and being associated culturally. And I will take a quote from Richard Nixon's domestic policy chief to kind of give us a clue of what happens next. So this is a quote from John Ehrlichman. He was the Nixon administration domestic policy chief. This is a quote from 1994 in an interview with a journalist. And I'll read from him. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So we got this sort of like inside insight into what is going on in the government in response to the proliferation of psychedelic use, which then results in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Essentially, at this point, it's classifying psilocybin and other drugs as Scheduled 1 drugs, which means that they're defined as having no currently accepted medical use and have a high potential for abuse. And this effectively shuts down psychedelic research that was going on in the 50s and 60s. There was upward of 1,000 studies that had been done in those decades, and that all gets kind of squashed and quieted down. And there's this like just period of no research going on. Then in the very late 1990s, John Hopkins establishes a psilocybin research program. They published their first kind of groundbreaking paper in 2006. And then that's sort of like the revival of psychedelic research. So just want to kind of give this context of like, why are we coming in with biases? Why are we coming in as if like, hey, this is like a new frontier. This is something that's only legal in 2 states. There's a strong history of that, and I don't want people to associate a history of propaganda and a history of sort of like this kind of smear campaign and take it to mean something more than that. And hopefully we can kind of now more so move into like what is it we're actually talking about, move beyond internalized biases that we might have around the substance.
Okay, so now we're going to be starting to move into exploring some more about what this treatment is and some of the potential mechanisms of action. So here I wanted to like acknowledge broadly, so that there is the broader field of psychedelic assisted therapy. Today we're going to be focusing, particularly on psilocybin assisted therapy, but having at least some acknowledgement of these practices more broadly with other substances as well. So it is a therapeutic approach combining psychedelics with psychotherapy. And we are going to be talking about like there being sometimes some different places where the psychotherapy takes in a larger role during preparation and integration compared to necessarily as much during the administration session and where some of those separations lie. But also, with as we're talking about kind of like the FDA approvals, there has been this really interesting FDA conundrum that has been showing up because when we are looking at this idea of the therapeutic approach, combining psychedelics with psychotherapy. So when MDMA assisted therapy came up for FDA approval, there are a number of different reasons why it's believed that the FDA approval didn't go through. But one really interesting, again, conundrum that is coming up is that it was actually the first time that the FDA was attempting to approve a therapy, not just a medication. So it actually creates this really interesting thing of figuring out, and the FDA was struggling with identifying how much are we saying that the drug or the medicine is creating the change versus that the therapist is creating the change. Whereas like in this space, we really look at the overlap of those two and the importance of like the therapist, and the FDA doesn't really actually have a good model for figuring out how to approve that combination. And this, again, we are looking at focusing on mental health conditions like PTSD, depression, anxiety, addiction. However, again, in some of these models, like in Oregon and Colorado, you are not required to have a mental health diagnosis in order to engage in these treatments. You are allowed to engage in them for like personal exploration, for personal growth, for self-discovery. You aren't required to have a formal diagnosis. And it involves preparation, guided sessions, and post-session integration. So we will dive in some more about this idea of there being kind of this like three-pronged approach and this three-phase approach and what is included in each of those. And again, just looking at some of the substances that are commonly used. So here we'll be talking about psilocybin. We will be talking about, some other areas where psilocybin is used, not only for depression and existential distress, but again, those are the most kind of like heavily researched at this time is for treatment-resistant depression. And here with existential distress in particular with individuals with terminal diagnoses, that there has been a lot of really beautiful research done in that area. MDMA, it has been primarily researched with PTSD, and does have very strong research support for treating PTSD. And it also has some really interesting applications for couples therapy. And there are some studies currently like ongoing that are looking at couples-based MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. Ketamine, I'm guessing that, most of you are probably more familiar with ketamine. It is currently kind of approved off label for treating like depression and can be effective for depression and more present suicidal ideation. So for some individuals, they might do like ketamine to be able to kind of like get into potentially a less acute state before moving into doing psilocybin assisted therapy, or use ketamine afterward to continue kind of processing their experience. So it can be an effective medication to potentially use like in concert with psilocybin assisted therapy, or even be able to like get more used to kind of a dissociative state, leaning into the process before potentially moving into psilocybin assisted therapy. More research has been going into LSD again as well for studying anxiety and mood disorders. And ibogaine is a really interesting one that is gaining a lot more kind of like recognition and traction in research in recent months. There is some consideration in Colorado for adding ibogaine underneath the Natural Medicine Act. And it is showing some really, really amazing research outcomes for opiate dependence. Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to move into, mechanisms of action. So we have kind of a list here of some various potential mechanisms of action. We're really going to be kind of diving in primarily on the top three. For some of those other ones, we kind of have this view of that, these are some similar processes that we might see in other forms of psychotherapy, where there is, kind of this like processing, that is occurring. So we wanted to more so dive in a little bit more deeply within the mechanisms of action that might be a little bit more unique for this treatment approach. Yeah.
Okay. Um, Yeah, so let's talk about Michelle's going to go quite in depth and spend some time on like what does the therapy look like, but I want to talk about what is happening in our bodies and brains when we ingest psilocybin. I'm going to use the word psilocybin, mushrooms, medicine, all interchangeably around here. To understand, I want us to have a basic understanding of this proposed network in our brain called the default mode network. And here in highlighted colors, you can see the regions that are involved in this network. We're not going to go too deep into any of these specifically, but they're named here, and there's a article if you want to dive a little bit more further into this.
Okay, I'm going to jump in really quickly because we just got a great question that I want to clarify. So Claire asked, how does the Natural Medicine Act allow for MDMA and LSD if they are not natural because they are lab synthesized? That's a really great question. So in the Natural Medicine Act, which is what we're going to be talking about, it is currently only psilocybin that is approved. So that's why we're going to be specifically going into psilocybin-assisted therapy. That is currently like the only like substance like here that we're like going to be talking about that is legally approved in the Colorado model. So unfortunately, like MDMA and LSD, that still would be considered like underground, that it would be an illegal like substance to be able to be providing even in like this state. We just wanted to reference that there are other substances within the broader context of psychedelic assisted therapy that are being researched and potentially have like their own unique benefits for clients.
So what is the default mode network involved with? And again, I do want to call out like this is one way of viewing what is important in this process. Again, if we were in a different culture, we might not be even really considering neurophysiology at all. But again, within this context, this is sort of where we have focused on and noticed this maybe strongest potential mechanism of action. So the default mode network is a network or kind of a set of associations in our brain that are active when our mind is not actively focused on a task. So this can be noticed if someone's going into a functional MRI study and maybe they're going to be doing math within that study before they're actually given a task and they're kind of just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. This is actually the network in the brain that's going to be more active. So hence default mode. This is the network that's active at default. And through research, we've learned that this network is associated with several kind of common human experiences. So it's associated with, actually, I do want to kind of maybe back up a little bit as I'm starting to describe these things. I assume most people here are clinicians, and I actually want you to move into a little bit and put your clinical hat on right now and start kind of asking yourself the question, why might this be helpful? So as I'm going to go through the mechanism of action, I kind of want you to come up with your own answer first, of like, why is this important? Why is this network related at all to depression or the concerns that my clients are having? So put your clinical hat on as you're listening to this. And I'll assist with some maybe questions after I describe things. So we know that this network is associated with a sense of independent or differentiated self. So this idea that like I am me and not you. Like I know I am Alex and I am a separate entity than Michelle, and I am just like a singular being here. So that's the default mode network is engaged or supportive of that sort of like felt sense. It's also involved in our narratives about ourselves. It helps us integrate various experiences that we've had across a lifetime into some sort of coherent narrative. So the sense of I have a story. So it's part of my narrative of I'm from New Jersey, and at some point I got married, and at some point I became a psychologist, and so on. So it kind of takes all these events in my life and puts them into this cohesive narrative. It's also associated with mental time travel, with the ability to imagine the future and also to replay the past in our minds. There's a lot of other elements of our human experience that the default mode network is involved in, but these are just some that I'm really going to focus on and highlight. So we know from studies that when someone's default mode network is overly active, it's often associated with an experience of rumination, with really rigidly holding on to core beliefs and stories about ourselves. We also know that this network can get oriented to traumatic material, that traumatic material can really be elevated in one's story. So, now given these and with your clinical hats on, like kind of think to yourself, why might it be helpful to quiet this network down for someone who is depressed? Why might it be helpful to quiet this down for someone who's feeling, say, lonely and isolated? Right? Really honing in on like we have a sense of differentiated self. I am like separate than you. How might that be involved? Or what might be helpful about quieting this down for people experiencing isolation? Or for a client who feels worthless, who has a story around they haven't contributed to the world, or maybe who feels guilty or regretful about their life and is really oriented toward the past. We'll keep those in mind. And let's keep going through a few more kind of mechanisms of actions, things that are kind of happening simultaneously to the default mode network quieting down. We also, when a person's ingested the medicine, there's increased entropy in a system. So to just kind of define entropy, in a low entropy system, it's a system that is very rigid and hierarchical and has limited communications across regions. So think of like streams that are cut into a mountainside, like they kind of flow. They don't just spill out everywhere. There's like a line from A to B, and they don't go outside those lines. And it's just kind of orderly and neat in how that water is going to run down a mountain on a typical day. In a high entropy system, there's a bit more chaos. There's a system that's more flexible and malleable, kind of more flat than hierarchical, and there's increased communication across regions. So to really show this, this is like my favorite image from psychedelic research. This is based on data driven through studies. So that we're actually kind of looking at like very pretty data, but this is actual data. And on the left is a brain not on psilocybin, and on the right is a brain on psilocybin. And each around the outer rim, each color represents a various region, and the lines transversing across the circle represent communication from one region to another. So we see with the introduction of psilocybin, all the regions are much more talking to each other. Um, and again, so if we want to think about like how much of therapy is an attempt to have people see the world, themselves, or others in new ways, but people are really held into these rigid ideas, right? We're really trying to have people in some way through, I kind of view across therapies, like we want people to see the world in new light. And thinking about what can someone have in that experience if this is actually their brain, if this is actually on a physiological level that they have this experience to have new insights or new thoughts of the world. There's this so much greater flexibility and able to do this.
I kind of think of this of like bringing us back to like our child mind in some ways, where that there is more like curiosity, playfulness, like less rules of like this, item has to be used in this way, or I am like this being, I have these certain limitations, and instead like connect us back into that like space of like wonder and curiosity and opportunity.
Yeah, lovely. So with your clinical hat, like think to yourself, how might this be helpful for someone to enter this state if they have really rigid black and white thinking or other cognitive errors? Maybe someone who can't consider other alternatives, who always will see themselves as a piece of crap. without intervention. Maybe someone who knows something intellectually but doesn't really believe it or feel it on a deeper level. That's such a common report in engaging like in a cognitive therapy of like, yeah, I can say with like 80% I believe that something's not my fault, but like there's no matter what I say to myself, there's something still locked away that feels like it's my fault. And we can consider this as kind of an analogy or analogous process of like opening that up and considering something new and feeling it in a new way. The last piece I want to focus on for a mechanism of action is just to kind of broadly name that there's really strong neuroplasticity, especially during that administration session. But there's also evidence that that increased neuroplasticity lasts for about 7 to 10 days afterward. So there's increased generation of neurons and synapses. So there's like tangible evidence that we can see it within a brain of like there are new connections forming. There's often this kind of directive of like, after you ingest psilocybin, do not make any life changes or decisions in the next 2 weeks. Like this is
It's like end your marriage.
don't quit your job, don't get divorced. Like let things settle in because your brain is a bit scrambled right now. So like very much like journal and work towards these things and sit with them and kind of behaviorally chill
Be
out.
able to say, after 2 weeks, like, this opened up that I did like recognize like these, large changes that need to shift in my life that might, like lead into like those types of, behaviors or actions. But trying, I think there can be like sometimes this worry of like if I don't act now, then I'll never do this. And so being able to, try to encourage this idea of like, these insights like what like can stay with you. That's part of like this integration process and not to, be making these like large rush decisions.
You're good at this. So if we want to kind of just think of this through a metaphor or analogy, like therapy, this is like therapy-wise, sort of the equivalent of going to the gym and having a session count like 100 times towards your strength building. Like this is a place where maybe but we'll talk about this in application a little bit later. But like this is maybe the time where it's just like I've like worked in therapy for so long towards this thing and I just like can't get myself to like push towards it or I'm just kind of rigid and stuck. This sense, this knowledge that there's increased neuroplasticity really supports this idea of like, and there's so many ways to get someone unstuck through this medicine. So just to kind of name these things I've been asking you to consider with your clinical hat on is kind of like taking these from like we're talking about the physiology. Let's really just kind of name and solidify some of the things that we can take away from these physiological changes. So we can think of a pathological mind, a mind that is not working effectively, as a mind that has rigid thinking patterns and loops and rumination of having really strong and rigid associations between thoughts, feelings, and sensations in certain patterns. A really strong sense of ego or I and a disconnection from others, other people, and potentially other non-human entities, like I'm separate from the world and disconnected from nature, whatever it might be around us. And a lot of history reviewing and future predicting, all kind of going in. So, psychedelic or psilocybin assisted therapy can help loosen these rigid patterns and allow for new development of views of the world, self, and other, and bring about new emotional responses as well. This is not just a purely cognitive exercise, there's a really strong, powerful emotional component to this.
Yeah, actually, we just got a question that, highlights as well. So Rose asked, like, is this like supercharging the process that happens gradually, hopefully, in therapy? And yeah, I would say kind of like at the baseline that oftentimes, when we are talking about kind of like even like the role of like you potentially as a primary therapist, that a lot of like the therapy work is kind of can be this like extended like, preparation process. But then for individuals like that, the psilocybin assisted therapy can just either like allow for like more processing happening in a short period of time. So oftentimes people will say, like that session felt like years worth of therapy happening kind of in like this one session. And then being able to again kind of like still like carry those insights forward. So we very much view it as like I describe integration as like Integration is how do we not just have this be, hey, that was a cool, fun day, but like, how is it that this is leading toward, kind of like behavioral, like, changes in my life? How do I carry these insights forward? How do I embody them in my life going forward? So yeah, a lot of the themes can map and do map on really, really well with, CBT, with ACT, EMDR, IFS, like a lot of like the approaches, a lot of the themes are like very in line with those things that we, are working on in therapy. But the medicine can kind of, I like how Rose said, kind of supercharge that experience.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Um, yeah, to kind of also like clarify, and we'll talk about this a little bit of like, there's kind of two modes to use this within as like an adjunct to ongoing existing therapy, or for some people in some contexts, some situations may be appropriate as sort of like the only therapeutic thing they are doing formally. We would still encourage self-reflection and other kind of like non-structured or things you don't pay for necessarily. So just kind of want to make that distinction. This can be an adjunct or standalone.
Okay, so now we're going to start moving into some more of like what does this model really look like and what's involved with it. So already alluded to, this kind of like three-phase approach for this kind of like core model. We'll be going like more in depth with each of these phases. So the preparation phase being focused on establishing rapport, assessing readiness, building trust, clarifying intentions, and safety planning. And as we'll talk about in the legal model, a lot of paperwork. The dosing session is supporting an inner-directed experience, ensuring safety, observation, and reflection. And integration assisting, again, meaning making, emotional processing, and behavior change. A really good question that we had earlier on that I now want to circle back to is kind of like how often you might engage in this treatment. And I wish that I had like a better answer for that. I'll say like there is, a lot of research that is focused on and showing substantial benefit with a single session. Um, there are some individuals who might do multiple sessions within kind of a treatment protocol. However, it's pretty rare that you would do them like really like back to back. You build up a tolerance to psilocybin quite quickly in your system. So often having some degree of kind of like time and like spacing between administration sessions can be important. For kind of like the length of the benefits, like we're seeing a lot of variability. We're seeing some individuals where again with like a single session, they're having, that they're no longer qualifying for a diagnosis of depression for 6 months, a year. Recently, there was a study that was released that was showing, I think it was like 2 or 3 years out of no longer qualifying for depression, with the caveat of the individuals who are not using this as a standalone are tending to receive like the most benefits. So they're using it as a catalyst to, continue on in their therapy and go deeper with their therapy, but are seeing like, greater and like better outcomes compared to therapy alone. But there are some individuals where they might view it as like, okay, I'm coming in once a year for this as kind of like this like maintenance kind of like view like on my, like symptoms. I've also had some clients where at the end of their journey, they're like, oh, now I realize all this other stuff I need to work on. And whether that is now I'm going to my primary therapist to be processing that, or I've had some people say, you know what, I think maybe in 6 months or a year, I might want to come in again to kind of, I feel like I've cleared out certain aspects and now I want to work on something else. I had one client who was like, had done some of this work previously with another facilitator where they worked on some kind of childhood trauma. And then when they came to me, they were like, okay, I feel like I've healed a lot of aspects and now I want this to be just about my relationship with myself. So I think that there can be, different ways of going about this. So we don't have a good answer about kind of like how often, and it really can be individual.
Yeah. I'd also say and this will be covered a little bit in some of the ethical discussion that we have of like the treatment is expensive. And there's some like, I think what facilitators would ideally want does not always match up with what is like financially available to people. Like a lot of times I hear discussion of like people would really love to bring in a client and do a lower dose to help someone get oriented to and kind of begin the process and then meet again somewhat soon after that to do a higher dose. And also that's really cost prohibitive. And for a lot of people, they're flying out of state, they're flying to Colorado or Oregon from somewhere else. They're taking time off work, they're paying the cost.
Hotels.
Yeah, exactly. So for a lot of people, like the feasibility may only be like, oh, I think I can only afford this like one time and then like in my present life.
And, which we'll talk about a lot, is then a really interesting thing that we're trying to balance is then expectations. that come within that. With the high cost, if it does feel like this is my one shot and so much is riding on this, there can be a lot of difficulties that can show up around kind of like expectations of this process.
We have so many soapboxes that we can get on. Well, if there's time at the end, we might just like have a soapbox extravaganza.
Here we wanted to like note for within the Colorado regulated model, there being lots of different licensed entities. This we want to highlight for a few different like reasons. One, that like this is gatekeeping, and that's like for better or worse. That there are some aspects within this that the idea is to promote more safety within this. Like for instance, with the growers, that they are state licensed growers, that the mushrooms that are tested by a state licensed facility, so that we know the purity, we know the potency, so that we can be able to be more refined within like dosage and know what we're giving people. However, that also does like, reduce like access of who can, of who is able to be like licensed to provide these services. And, frankly, when we are talking about the cost, like looking at this is part of like why these services are so high cost. And some are like so many people are trying to figure out how do we reduce cost, how do we reduce cost, but like every single one of these levels has very high state licensing fees, very high insurance fees. So like a lot of these healing centers like aren't profitable. They aren't viewing this as this like money making scheme, despite the high costs. It's that like the cost of operations right now are incredibly high for these services.
And to name, Healing Center is the facility where the journey or the
Yeah.
administration is physically happening.
Yeah, so that is, yeah. So there is like a state licensed healing center. So these services have to occur at a state licensed facility. There are a few caveats to where in Colorado you can do in-home administration under very, very specific conditions. If an individual is homebound, that there are end-of-life care needs, but you need a higher level of training to be able to be a facilitator in those instances. And in those instances, it's required to have two facilitators present or have the session video recorded, which brings in, of course, all sorts of aspects around confidentiality. So yeah, but in general has to take place within a healing center. There's also what's called a handler license. There are so many fun little nuances in this work around. So you can choose as a facilitator to have a handler's license. The handler is who is allowed to physically handle and touch the mushrooms. I, as a facilitator, for all sorts of reasons, have opted not to have a handler's license. So like at the administration session, while I'm engaging in like the facilitation, all sorts of areas, I am not allowed to physically touch the mushrooms. I can't take them out of the safe and hand them to the client. I have to have a licensed handler on staff who does that step. And then facilitator. In Colorado, there is a distinction of clinical versus non-clinical facilitators. Oregon currently doesn't have this distinction, but they are looking at adding it. There are some aspects of some different like pros and cons within this. So the clinical facilitator distinction in Colorado is that you must have a license in some behavioral health field. So you must be licensed in some other way. There are some really wonderful aspects with having this like distinction. It provides some extra protection for licensed therapy providers to be able to provide these services. It also allows, in Oregon, there's kind of this interesting distinction because they don't have this, where they say, okay, when you're a facilitator, you have to take off your therapist hat when you're like, doing like psilocybin-assisted therapy, and looking at, like, can we do that? How do we do that? Is that, maybe a detriment to the treatment if we're doing that? And also, unfortunately, it also limited facilitators from being able to work with their own therapy clients in this space. So were having to refer out their own therapy clients to other facilitators for this treatment, even if they are licensed themselves, which I, personally think is, a detriment to where ideally we would want, that therapy experience to be helpful in, helping these clients get further in this. But in Colorado, we are able to, work with our own clients in this space with this clinical distinction. And then non-clinical facilitators, again, are individuals who don't have that behavioral health license or background. So it can be like traditional healers, ancestral healers. It can be individuals of like body workers, other forms of kind of like backgrounds. who then still go through rigorous training as a facilitator. So to become a licensed facilitator, you're required to do 140 hours worth of training at within a state license program. Sorry, my cold is kind of kicking up on me. And then you are required to do supervision hours and practicum hours and supervision hours on top of that before you can become licensed as a clinical or non-clinical facilitator. Okay. So we're going to move into discussing some of what happens during preparation. During this prep, it can be in person or telehealth. I would say that on average, about 50% of the clients that we're seeing kind of in these services are traveling in from out of state where these services are not available. So we have been able to navigate that really well. We're used to that process and doing that preparation over telehealth. Or I've had some clients who travel to Colorado for, 10 days, and we do that preparation, in person before their actual administration session. So some of it is ensuring that, this is a good fit, that not only that the treatment is a good fit, but also that good fit, between the provider and the client. In Colorado, only one session is technically required of preparation. I don't know anyone who's doing only one session. With 2 sessions, I would say my experience is about 30% of that time is spent doing the state required paperwork. Some of the paperwork is actually helpful kind of in that preparation process, but knowing that if it's one session, you're spending almost the entire time doing paperwork. So the majority of facilitators are doing a minimum of 2 sessions. I'd say that 2 sessions has become kind of the standard in a lot of areas, but that it is, lots of us want it to be more. But oftentimes there's kind of this package cost for these services, and usually 2 is included, and that you can add for additional cost, additional prep sessions. But unfortunately, because it's already so high cost, a lot of clients opt not to do that. Involves psychoeducation about kind of this process, some of the mechanisms of action like we already have been discussing, and this idea of kind of these flight instructions. So we'll talk some more about this idea of kind of the mindset for within this. And really it is trying to create this mindset of openness, of curiosity, of being able to lean in and kind of move through this experience. A lot of kind of mindfulness, act-based kind of tenets within this. And so some of these flight instructions, if you see a door, go through it. If you see a staircase, climb it. If you see a monster, ask it, what are you trying to teach me? So very much within this is how do you move toward and through, toward and through, toward and through, that the more that there is kind of resistance and fighting against the experience can potentially kind of increase that potential of having a difficult experience. There's also the history gathering. On the next slide, we'll go more in depth with this concept of intention setting, which is, what you're wanting to work toward. Informed consent and lots of forms. One interesting kind of unique form that I want to highlight that takes place here, because we're going to talk about a later slide of some of the unfortunate history of abuses that also have occurred in this practice. So one of the forms that we complete in Colorado is called a supportive touch contract. So while, traditionally in therapy, you don't really touch your clients, in this work, there is, some understanding that sometimes supportive touch can be a positive and helpful aspect to be able to help ground the client, to be able to help with emotional release, to be able to provide this supportive, caring presence. So in Colorado, the only places where we are even allowed to offer supportive touch is hands on hands, hands on shoulder, and hands on feet. I don't have a whole lot of good research around the feet one. A lot of times clients are kind of for that last one. So those are the only places we are allowed to offer it. And so we contract ahead of time. Where do you feel comfortable with touch occurring? How will you let me know if you want supportive touch? How will you let me know if you are removing consent for supportive touch? And all of this takes place ahead of time while clients are fully sober, and whatever is agreed upon in that supportive touch contract is kind of the highest level that touch will occur. The one caveat we give is for safety circumstances, if I'm helping escort you to the bathroom and you become unsteady and I have to catch you, I might have to touch you not on your hand or your shoulder, in those types of circumstances. But but really knowing that these medicines can really open up and reduce barriers and boundaries, that we do not want to take advantage of that in any way. So, if someone says, like, I do not want touch, and in the session they change their mind, you remind them of the supportive touch contract. You offer other ways of providing support, but you do not go beyond what was discussed ahead of time.
If I could say a few things to that, if you recognize, part of the default mode network is this like sense of like me being embodied an individual. So like genuinely, someone may in one of the administration sessions have a sense of like I am outside of my body, and this is like terrifying for me. So that physical touch really is one of the ways that we can connect with people and help ground them. And I've heard that a lot about touch for feet. This can just be like a way of like reminding like I'm still here. There's still someone present.
I
That's
still have
not
a body.
that. Yeah, I still have a body in a way that's not too intrusive. We have a couple questions that come up in the chat that I'm going to save for later. I think they're great questions. Just want to name that there. So thanks for.
I do want to mention that someone asked if we are going to be talking more about difficult experiences, and we will. Yeah, we'll give a little bit more of a description of potentially what a difficult experience could entail.
Here's a live question. How often do you find that people opt to allow for supportive touch? It said supportive trust. I assume supportive touch in preparation, and how often do they ask for that during the experience?
So I have yet to have a client completely decline any sort of supportive touch. There very much have been sometimes where it is of like only my hands or only my shoulder. But I have had every client that I've worked with so far has been okay with like that potential for it to be used in these like limited circumstances. Um, but I also often say just because you consent does not mean that then it will be used. I would say the majority of my sessions, they have consented to supportive touch, and either A, yes, they haven't asked for it, and it hasn't seemed as though it was like indicated kind of in the session. So again, it's just because that consent is there doesn't mean that it is always used. Um, but there have been clients where they have said where they've like wanted like a handhold, that they have wanted help with kind of like that grounding. I often like tell clients of like I'm going to be checking in on you occasionally just to kind of like see how you're doing. Is it okay if I even just like put like a hand on your shoulder as I'm kind of checking in, and being able to just like talk about and like recognize where's that consent. Will my touch maybe feel like supportive, or what might that be triggering in any sort of way?
There are some, unsurprisingly, touching your clients is a hot topic. So we're getting quite a few questions in here. What I would say is let's really try to reserve some time at the end to go into this. I think it's fascinating and it's important, and it is one of the biggest places of divergence from traditional talk therapy. So I want to have time and understand that this is very curious for people. But I also want to make sure we cover all our content. To the last two people in the chat who have posed this as a question, will you please use the question and answer format? That way, I kind of have those tracked and in a list, and it won't get lost if there's more chat that happens. That'd be really helpful, and we'll try to come back to this at the end.
All right. Another area in the preparation can be discussing dosage. There's a lot of different factors that go into considering dosage. So unfortunately, within this, it's not an exact science of knowing this exact amount equals this experience. There's a lot of different factors. So some of the things that we talk about with clients might be certain medications that they're on. Do they have a prior history of using psychedelics? How sensitive do they tend to be to substances? Of alcohol, marijuana, even like sleep medications, things like that. How emotionally open do they tend to be compared to how guarded do they tend to be? But we also are kind of working against countering a lot of messaging around dosage that can also be helpful or like not translate well within the regulated market. So kind of like in general, when people read about experiences or hear about their friends' experiences, or even went on like retreats or things, oftentimes they talk in terms of like grams of amount of mushrooms that they consumed. But there can be quite a bit of variability of potency with across like different strains of mushrooms. So with us having kind of like the lab testing, we can get a little bit more specific on the potency of the mushrooms and the active component of psilocin that is in the mushrooms. So we work instead of talking about milligrams of psilocin as opposed to grams of mushrooms. because sometimes like someone might like be saying of, like I read about this like 5 gram kind of like experience of like a hero dose kind of thing. And that like dosage, we're kind of like in general in the community that might equate vaguely to about a 50 milligram, dosage. That would be maybe about like 3.25 grams of some of like the strains that we have in the centers. So working a lot on messaging, also working on that like messaging of like when people are saying like they want a hero dose, like what's driving that, what is it that they're really looking for, what do they feel like they need to experience, are they trying to get someone else's experience that they read about? And that can be an important thing of just because you have this amount doesn't mean we can guarantee that's what your experience is going to be. So yeah, there can be a lot of discussion around kind of like these hopes and how that kind of like maps on to dosage.
And a couple of things, in my training, we talk about helping people choose an experience that they're kind of guiding toward, and maybe kind of thinking of levels and kind of describing, hey, at a certain level, you might be kind of crying because everything seems perfect. At a certain level, you may be just like totally out there. I think a fun quote that I heard
I think
from
you have it on a
Andrew,
different slide.
just to name it, is like, I am the universe giving birth to itself in a fire of eternal ecstasy. And people like Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind has like really oriented people to this idea of like, I need an ego dissolution. I need to completely lose myself. And if we actually look at some of the dosing, that's like the dosage that's used in clinical trials that's having amazing outcomes, relatively speaking, the doses are not that crazy high.
Yeah. So that's been an interesting thing. Yeah. So in most research, the dosage has been about 20 to 25 milligrams. And that's where, again, I think I've had like sometimes some clients where they come in saying like, oh, like the research, is really driving like my interest in this. But then they also read these other accounts and they can get kind of caught that maybe if they didn't get the experience that they were hoping for of, I just didn't do, just didn't take enough. Like, I talked to my friend and I told them how much I took and they said, oh, well, I've taken this much. Like, there's no way that you took enough. And being able to like really recognize again, like some of this messaging that maybe doesn't translate or some of the expectations compared to like what we're actually seeing for dosage in the research and the effectiveness that can be there.
Oh, there's so many good y'all's questions. I'm like hungry to answer. It's hopefully coming. Let's get through the content. Please keep coming with these questions. I know it's a little disjointed to answer to return to topics, and I just want to be mindful of time.
So intention setting, looking at kind of goals versus intention. So again, we can't kind of, necessarily create this like a particular experience that someone's going to have or necessarily have a particular outcome. And moving into more, I think of this kind of, of like more like values oriented, where it's a bit broader, these overarching like themes, more expansive rather than directive. I've had a lot of clients who at the end of this have said, I got what I needed, but not how I expected. So really, again, kind of like leaning into like openness and curiosity to this experience to allow things to unfold in unexpected ways. So I kind of think of like, like almost in therapy, we can often take these overarching themes and try to translate them into how they would look behaviorally. Whereas with intention setting, it's kind of like we're doing the opposite of, like what is it that like you might want to see be different in your life, but then how does this relate to these kind of like broader themes? So here's some example intentions. These are all example intentions from like clients I have had. Explore the barriers to trusting myself. Open myself to healing grief and disconnection so I can live with peace, presence, and love. Learn that I am more than the emotions that are keeping me stuck. To release rigidity and judgment and connect to presence and compassion. To experience myself as lovable and worthy from the inside, not just as a thought. To open myself to the possibility of relief in order to reconnect with the parts of myself that feel buried. And these are some of the things that we're identifying kind of in this preparation process, and then asking clients to, journal on these intentions, reflect on them, post them somewhere, and be, kind of like reading them and keeping them at the forefront, kind of headed into the administration session. I might read, the client's intentions to them as they're ingesting the mushrooms. But then also, we might use the intentions again to potentially maybe kind of bring people back, if they're feeling, kind of like disoriented or things. But also kind of like once the medicine is in your system, there's a little bit of kind of like you almost like set the intention and then let it go. And instead, again, rather than using that intention to try to direct the experience, move more into these like grounding statements or mantras such as trust and let go, accept and release, all is welcome, to be able to kind of like lean into those aspects more so during the actual administration experience. There's this large kind of like emphasis in this work on this concept of set and setting. So set is referring to mindset, so some of the things that we've been talking about, and then the setting, the environment. So a lot of the research shows set and setting is a very important component of this work and for this work to be effective compared to someone just like taking mushrooms at a rave or at a festival, and what that experience might be like. So the mindset is, again, what is the internal state going into the session? What are your beliefs, the expectations, again, intentions, emotional tone. And again, with the expectations, it's hard. A lot of these people, who are coming in for these treatments, they've tried a lot of things. And they've, been reading a lot and seeing things in the news and watching documentaries and listening to podcasts and hearing of like the pauses within this. So there might be this idea of like, I've tried everything and it feels like this might be the key. Also, again, the high cost within this, just understandably, like people, there is this like, it's hard within this to have it be transactional in this way with like money. And, like we have in kind of this view of like, I give you money means I get this in return. And, being able to kind of like navigate, just kind of the expectations surrounding that. I think media also, sometimes can be maybe exaggerating people's experiences. I think that like within that isn't always even intentional. But where we're going to talk about with different experiences, some of it's really hard to put into language, and to be able to describe to people who haven't had these experiences what it's really like. And so I think that sometimes when we are trying to translate it and put it into language, there's something lost in that translation. There's something to where we might lean more heavily on certain visuals or things like that, because that's more easily communicated. But then that can also, I think, like set people up for these kind of expectations of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get these like certain visuals. I'm gonna see my ancestors, whereas you might not have seen them. You might be like felt that, or that again, your experience might be much more embodied and somatic. That might be a little bit harder to kind of like translate and looking at, like what again these expectations and hopes are for this experience. And it can be really helpful to ask clients ahead of time, how would they feel if they didn't get the experience that they were hoping for? And being able to kind of like prepare, for that potential. The setting, the environment. So, this is the external context, so not only like looking, part of the setting is, our like the general societal messaging around these like treatments. Do you have family support? If you told people in your life around this, like, are you afraid that there might be judgment? But then also the actual like physical environment. So that includes things like safety, lighting, comfort. We're gonna be showing some pictures of a couple of healing centers that I work at, the aesthetics and the interpersonal like dynamics. And yeah, that the therapist plays a really key role in creating this like safe, supportive setting. I have found for like a lot of people, while there can be some downsides again to the regulated market, for some people it feels safer that they know that they're like, I'm not doing something illegal. I know where like these medicines are coming from, that helps create that sense of safety. And having this environment where they feel really like safely held allows them to kind of like lean in more deeply to the experience. Um, Also, again, for like one of the positives with all of the regulations, safety wise, is like people have a place where they can, report complaints and things like that without worrying about that they were doing something illegal. So some of the hopes, again, with like some of these regulations, as unfortunate some of them can feel sometimes, is trying to promote safety for clients. And then music can be an important role. We'll talk a little bit more about that on this next slide. Okay. So moving into the administration or journey session. So it says here of like 4 to 6 hours. So kind of a typical kind of like course, a little bit of like these sessions. So session, once you ingest the medicine in Colorado, if you are taking this like macro dose, once you ingest the medicine, you are required to stay on site for a minimum of 5 hours. So there usually is a little bit of time ahead of time, of just like getting settled into the space, talking, things like that, before you ingest the medicine. The medicine usually starts to come on and you're starting to feel the effects after around like 20, 30 minutes or so. I'd say I'm often finding that for most people, their time actually kind of like in the medicine, kind of in that journey experience is around 2.5 to 3.5 hours. We can offer about an hour in a potential booster dose, which would be a lower dose of about 5 to 10 milligrams. That can sometimes be used if people are wanting to get a bit deeper. Maybe they feel like they're kind of like, struggling to kind of like, connect. And it can be potentially a way of just kind of facilitating a little bit of a deeper process. Um, and so then there often is, again, at least like a couple hours after people are getting a little bit landed to just allow them to feel really settled. During that time, sometimes there might be some communication, like with the therapist where they are, like reflecting or sharing some of their experience, trying, starting to make sense of some of these themes. But sometimes they're, just silently reflecting. They're journaling. We usually have art supplies that people can use to be, doing some art therapy afterward. Before they're able to leave. Clients cannot drive themselves home. I realize that we didn't put that anywhere in here. You cannot drive yourself until the next day. So it does require coordination. Ideally with like, a loved one picking you up and driving you. Unfortunately, with like some of these things, like, there might be of using like a car service or something like that, but we try to avoid that where possible. Um, for the music, so usually there is like music playing kind of like in the space, and then headphones also provided for like a more enhanced experience. Typically, the music is primarily nonverbal. There might be some kind of like chanting or things like that. And really has been found to really enhance the experience. A lot of participants report that like the content or their emotions really like shift with the music. I've interestingly had a lot of clients be like, did you change this song at this time? Because like it just fits so perfectly like with like the theme that I was working on. Um, and while we try not to have clients kind of like overly direct the music choices, it can be important to assess for potentially triggering music, like music with particular kind of like cultural or religious affiliations or certain music that they really want. That might be kind of helping them lean into their experience. And no on the eye shades. So that isn't something that's required, but it often can help facilitate a more kind of like internal experience rather than like, hey, let's look at the cool visuals. Things are like changing colors to really cultivate that inner experience. And an eye shade can allow clients to still open their eyes while still having that inward focus. Um, and that really it's on this inward directed approach. So we're going to talk a little bit more kind of like the therapist's role, but it really is this non-directive approach. I kind of describe a little bit that it feels like my role is more of like a doula on the administration day, that my role is to try to kind of like support the client and whatever they need to like allow them to lean into this natural experience. So there is this view in this work of what's called the inner healing intelligence, that like we are not doing the healing. And with all the things that Alex talked about, like their minds being so open, we aren't wanting to insert things when their mind is so open. So rather, we are trying to allow them to tap into these aspects that they know for themselves that are within them and allowing them to be able to like make those connections. That's unfortunately one of the things also the FDA hasn't been the biggest fan of is this idea of this inner healing intelligence. They want to know that the medicine is making the change, not the person making the change. Um, and again, like for another kind of like analogy, like here, or like a metaphor, I kind of think of this, I use this metaphor of like a broken arm. When you go into the doctor, and they like maybe put a cast on, like the doctor isn't actually healing that bone. Your body knows what it needs to do for that healing and it heals itself. But the doctor is providing the environment for that healing to take place. So that's what we are trying to do here is provide that environment for that natural healing to take place. Quick note on kind of group versus individual. Most of my experience thus far has been, interestingly, my like experience with the medicine has mostly been group. My experience working has mostly been individual. So for groups, some considerations are: do they have prior experience? Do members of the group maybe have similar themes? So there might be like similar populations of like veterans groups or postpartum groups or things like that. Are they do they have more open intentions versus wanting really more specific individualized work? Group can be a bit more communal. It can increase the intensity of processing just because there's just a lot of energy and emotion in the room. Sometimes there can kind of be these like shared themes amongst like participants, almost like not that they're talking to each other, but there can be these interesting experiences of like several people noticing like that came up in my journey as well, or like I almost felt like you came into my experience.
Can I say something in that moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, just and it's experiences like that that are not too uncommon that, kind of in our scientific model, we don't have an easy explanation for. And this is where we do, like, as facilitators or facilitators in training, want to remain very open and allowing people to assign their own meaning to that. Because, there's this like there's such a range of experiences, and some of them are frankly like quite odd, or frankly quite like outside of our typical kind of consensus reality. So we as facilitators, while we're not necessarily going to encourage someone to move into a new direction spiritually or something like that, it's just important for us to be open-minded, because people are going to make their own interpretations of like, how did I communicate with that other person across the room when we both had eye shades and headphones on? So that's just where that like real like kind of cultural competence and self-awareness comes into play in my mind.
Yeah. And that again of like that aspect of kind of this like communal experience can be either like supportive or disruptive, kind of like depending. So, careful screening for those groups. Okay, so here we tried to, as I said, like these experiences can be very odd sounding, if you don't have kind of like prior experience with it. This is by no means an exhaustive list of, like potential experiences, but we wanted to just give some sort of a sense of what some of these might be. So time feeling distorted or non-existent. This idea of time feeling distorted, a couple of weeks ago, I had 2 sessions in like subsequent days. One client, when he was kind of coming out of the medicine, I was grounding him a little bit for kind of like what time it was in the day and things like that. He was like, "No way! Like you're not allowed to lie to me, right?" He's like, I thought that I was, in there for maybe like 20 minutes, and it had been several hours." Whereas the next day, a different client came out, and we were when she was getting ready to leave, like with her mother, and she was like, "I am so ready to get out of here. I've been here for 6 years." So like there could just be like really this like interesting kind of distortion and that's where sometimes where people say of like it feels like I've been, done years worth of therapy. Sometimes they're like people are like I relived my entire life or multiple lifetimes. I lived the lifetimes of my ancestors like in this experience. I died and was reborn. So there can be these interesting kind of like distortions of time. Sense of unity with others, nature, the universe, a sense of yourself softening or dissolving. So we talk about this idea of ego dissolution. And that while that can sound kind of like scary or kind of like what's like helpful around that for again, when we're looking at this idea of like what are the stories that you tell yourself of who you are? And if you were to kind of like melt that away, like what opportunities are there? Re-experiencing earlier moments, profound emotional openness, release, connection with ancestor spirits, sense of peace, acceptance, surrender, transformation into other forms or substances. I've had clients be like, I was a puddle, I was water all day. I was water, I was floating around, and they're like, talking about like all these experiences with their loved ones or things that they're like, but I was a puddle of goo. Which again, it's kind of hard to describe if you haven't had these experiences. And while again that we, can't promise or predict a particular experience, some of this, of like talking for dosage is some of what you're looking for. So for example, like a client with a terminal illness diagnosis might benefit from a higher dose that might bring them closer to exploring alternative realities, connection with deities, compared to someone who's wanting to work on aspects of their current existence. A more grounded, like potentially like lower dose experience might be more beneficial for what they're looking for. Okay, this therapist non-directive role says non-directive stance. So we don't again guide the content of the experience. Instead, we're holding space, offering reassurance, reflecting what arises, and trusting the client's inner healing intelligence. Also can be like a note taker, like for individuals in this experience. So I think like an example, for like how I might be able to like be like supportive in kind of facilitating someone's experience while not being overly directed. Like I had a client who at one point he came out of kind of his experience and was saying, I'm feeling this tension. Like, part of me tells me I'm here to be doing all of this work. I'm supposed to be processing all of these hard things that have happened. But this other part of me is saying, like, this is kind of fun. I'm kind of liking this feeling. I kind of want to just like lean into the fun. And I, just like reflected or offered, like, what might it be like to allow yourself the opportunity to feel fun? And that actually opened up the connection between those two things. And him saying, like I haven't been allowing myself to enjoy things. I've been punishing myself for all of these things from the past. And, being able to like lean into those themes. I also have had sessions where the client is fully silent their entire journey session. They are laying there, they are doing internal processing, they are getting a lot out of it, and they are not speaking to me. And even in that time afterward, they are journaling, they are personally reflecting, and they are not engaging with me. And so that is an interesting thing, I think, for like therapists within this is how to not overly insert yourself and like trust the client to do what they're needed and not feel like I'm not doing enough. I should be doing something if like if they are doing what they need to be doing and to kind of like let go of your ego as like the healer within this. Like you haven't like you're going to be having integration sessions. You're going to be talking to this person. You're going to be supporting person, and sometimes it's your presence that is that support of what they're needing. So having a really grounded, attuned, emotionally regulated presence, really responding with empathy, curiosity, with minimal interpretation at this time. There is time in integration, and again, supporting to move through the material rather than away from it. Okay. I'm going to go quickly through this because, I was afraid of this, so we had a lot of content. So here are a couple of pictures from a couple of healing centers that I work at. Left here is Reset LLC. That's in a little bit south, it's in Centennial, Colorado, a little bit south of Denver. So here you can see this like large couch is set up kind of like a bed. It's pretty wide, like people fit on it really well to be laying down. Blankets, eye shade, headphones, and things like that. Lots of, just kind of like soft lighting, lots of plants, not a ton of like content on the walls for, that could potentially kind of like influence content for the individual's experience. And then here, ETC Hospitality, here are like a couple of chairs. They also do have some like a large bed a couch that like pulls out to a day bed as well. But I have had a couple clients who really like journeying kind of in these chairs. And then here are a couple of pictures of some potential kind of like group options. So again, at Reset here, they have the option of kind of like small group sessions with like these 4 different cots, or it could be like couple sessions. These can be kind of like rearranged in different ways. Or on the right there is a setup at ETC Hospitality for a larger kind of group journey environment. Both Reset and ETC did give us permission to show these sessions or these pictures. Okay. So integration is integral and a very important part of this process. Again, how do we make this not just a cool day, but try to like carry these insights forward? So here's those ideally within 24 to 72 hours. It can really vary, though I found. I've had some clients where we schedule it 24 hours later, and then they're saying like, I still don't know how to put this into words. Like I need a little bit of time. I also think depending on the number of integration sessions that you're able to do with clients, I've had some clients that like if they're only having one integration session, that sometimes like the harder aspect for them is maybe like a week later, where the glimmer's wearing off a little bit. They're back into their regular day-to-day routine, and they're trying to figure out how do I hold on to these insights and these things that felt so easy and so powerful, a few days ago. That window of like in that 2 to 7 days of increased neuroplasticity. So we're looking at how do we optimize that window? How do we put practices into place? How do we keep kind of like, rehearsing these things that feel so important for you? Using, again, like this is where like some more of that like therapist kind of like hat can come back on, using, IFS like principles, Jungian ACT perspectives are often utilized. So there can be more of that, more traditional therapeutic intervention kind of at this stage, and setting these behavioral integration intentions for bringing it forward. And, things can be, reviewing journaling, meditation practices. There's some research showing that like While meditation might not normally be easy for your clients, that there can be this window after this period where practices that have not always been easy or have felt really out of reach for clients suddenly feel more accessible because they very, very much, engage in a very mindful, very meditative practice recently, and just kind of like that openness for that process being more available to them. Returning to the music that you listened to your playlist at the time of administration can be helpful, and looking at how you show up in your relationships. I do want to talk about this idea of there's this term called spiritual bypassing, which can be a challenge when participants have an experience that on the medicine, I experience the existence that how the world should be. And there being this challenge when they go back into their reality and it's not that way. Like I felt full connection within humanity and this openness and love. And then you go back into our very individualistic society and figuring out how do I reconcile these two things. And so really working with clients on how do you use that experience to better engage in your reality, in this reality, rather than saying I have to keep going back to the medicine because that's the true reality. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna turn over the questions to you. I don't know if there's any that you want to answer in here, because also we can hang out for questions after the 12 o'clock is technical ending for today.
And you're also they're going to be giving you our emails that you're welcome to contact us as well.
So I just want to cover a little bit of the research. And I may breeze through some of this to get through some of the juicier stuff, but I do want to kind of acknowledge some of these aspects. And I think I had mentioned earlier, there's been about in the realm of around 200 studies since 2006. A lot of that focused on major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression, and especially within this context of end of life, such as cancer diagnosis. So major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression are two diagnoses that the FDA has designated psilocybin as a breakthrough treatment for, which on one hand sounds really exciting. It says like, hey, there's a lot of promise here. And also we want to temper that with the recognition of that's just sort of like a bureaucratic term that reduces some of the red tape that is in place for these studies to help expedite them. Doesn't mean a specific conclusion at this time. There's also emerging support for generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, PTSD, substance use disorders, chronic pain, and disordered eating. And I also want to hold this in contrast to when Michelle was reading some individuals' intentions. Right, this is a really clinical way of thinking about this, and this is the way that we can be really effortful and precise with our research, and also recognize this may be helpful for people even if they don't have a specific diagnosis that's been given to them. Just sort of want to quickly cover a few research studies out there. These are all borrowed from some meta research. That link is down at the bottom. But one thing that stands out to me if we look across studies is how often we are looking at percentages not just of improvement, but in remission, in no longer meeting criteria for a certain diagnosis. So all of these studies either deal with major depressive disorder or depression and anxiety. And just to kind of read some of these highlights, because I think they're kind of representative of what we tend to see in research. There's some variability, but you can maybe gather the pattern here. Through these studies, we're looking at 54% in participants in remission at 14 days. And next study down, 46% in remission at 2 months for major depression. And again, the amazing thing to me is this is after a single dose. Sometimes studies have 2 doses somewhat close together in time. And of course, other integration and preparation services. So we're kind of thinking about a time-limited treatment, which is really different than thinking about a 16-session protocol or more, or thinking about SSRIs, which are ongoing. There's one of the Carhart Harris et al. Showed similar results in treating depression, psilocybin having a similar outcome to an SSRI, which has so many benefits in that, again, it's not a medication that needs to be continued on long term. Just to highlight some of these other ones, at 6 months by Griffiths in 2016, 71% of participants in remission, not meeting criteria for major depressive disorder, 63% for anxiety in the way that they define that. So again, we're seeing results be pretty significant. They're not 100%. It's not going to necessarily help or improve things for everybody, but for a research study, these are really impressive numbers and they tend to be pretty durable. We're
I would say
yeah.
very briefly.
Man, just I'm going to actually just skip this. This is really to demonstrate there's sort of like this movement within the pharmaceutical world right now to try to develop a medication that is psilocybin based or related that actually also takes away the perceived subjective experience of it. Um, which if pharmaceutical companies can create something that is helpful, great. And also, it seems kind of difficult to expect that to be helpful because so much of the content and the actual lived experience during an administration session is what appears to contribute to the outcomes. So, for one aspect of that, I wanted to share there's something called the Revised Mystical Experience Questionnaire that's commonly used in psychedelic research. And it essentially is kind of measuring how strong of a specific type of a mystical experience did someone have. And there's some qualities of these, including like can't be defined in words. There's sort of like a sense of I gained knowledge that is kind of irrefutable in my mind to this type of past peak experience that was brought to me. So this again highlights our need to be open-minded as clinicians and also recognizing there's a lot that can happen in a journey session, and it's important to sort of like honor that rather than to tear that down, and to recognize, at least through what we're seeing so far in research, that like that subjective experience is really important to the person. Again, I started a lot of my conversation here talking about quieting the default mode network. And it's not just about what happens on a physiological level, it's so much about what happens on a subjective, personal level. This is back to you for this slide.
Okay, so I was responding to some of the Q&A questions. Okay. So some research limitations. So a lot of this is, most of us are familiar with this in a lot of different places, unfortunately. Right now, in looking at the research, about 80+% of study participants are non-white or non-Hispanic white. There are a lot of questions around the best ways also to recruit within BIPOC populations. As Alex referred to before, the history of the war on drugs, and some very, very real and very, very reasonable institutional mistrust. There's a history of harms toward these populations for drug research. So the Tuskegee syphilis studies, a lot of early drug trials were done on prison populations, the CIA MK Ultra program. There is a long history of BIPOC populations being used for drug studies in ways without their consent, without telling them that they were being given psychedelic substances and not knowing what was happening when they were having these experiences. So there's very real and understandable mistrust. Also, there's limited data on socioeconomic status. So this data is often not collected, but there are structural biases due to factors such as these are really time-intensive trial protocols. You often are having to travel to specialized research sites. There's lack of compensation for time off work, high exclusion criteria. And as we've talked about, real like SES limitations in actual practice as well, that right now, unfortunately, the cost of these services is quite high. Limited LGBTQ representation, sexual orientation, and gender identity is reported in less than 10% of the trials. And that when demographic data has been collected, it's rarely been analyzed for between group outcomes. Oops, sorry. Hitting the wrong buttons. Trying to scroll through my notes here. Also, just Schedule I status has put large barriers on research, leading to small sample sizes, highly controlled populations, and exclusion of participants with comorbidities. And And there's also just a lack of workforce diversity. A lot of the researchers in this space also are primarily white.
So, how to talk with clients about this. So, if you are in a place where, oh, I think I may have a client or clients who may benefit from this, or maybe you as a clinician are highly interested and enthusiastic and want to talk to your clients. I want to help kind of form some guidelines. We'll actually have a slide on do's and don'ts of this. But I want to emphasize that as clinicians, we cannot like I put in quotes the word recommend, like we cannot recommend something that is federally illegal. So it is outside of our purview to say, I think you should do this. I think this would be beneficial for you. I recommend you to do this. That is not the kind of conversation that we should have. I think a really helpful analogy is to think about it if you are like a mental health clinician. Think about the way that you talk about medications, about psychotropic medications with your clients. So I, as a clinician, would be really outside. I'd be really remiss to say, I think you should take Zoloft at a certain dosage to a client. Like that is outside of my scope to be saying that. But as a clinician, I have plenty of conversations about medication with my clients. So we often are talking about what are your feelings about this, about getting on medications? Like what messages have you heard? What sort of ideas do you have around medications about what that means to you to be? And I hear you say, like, I'm a person on medication now. So we can do a lot of the therapeutic work around the idea of medication. And often I provide psychoeducation. So if someone were to come to me and said, like, yeah, I started an SSRI 4 days ago, it's not helping me, I think I should just stop. I would probably provide psychoeducation on how often people are usually like requested to stay on a medication, that it takes time to sort of build up in your system to be consistently moving across the blood-brain barrier. And similar, I might provide psychoeducation if someone's like, I want to stop cold turkey and say, like, here are some things that you potentially may experience if you were to do that. I really recommend you go talk with your medical provider about that. So from that stance of like, we can encourage us all as clinicians to talk about psychedelic assisted therapies with our clients from an educational standpoint to think of like who may be a good client for this. Some criteria to kind of think of are like someone, do they have willingness to move toward inner material, right? Like as Michelle was saying with the flight instructions, there is better outcomes when someone is willing to move toward what is coming up for them. So just kind of like a capacity to do that. Maybe this would be helpful for someone who can grasp therapy concepts logically, but have a difficulty translating it into some sort of felt sense. So that again, idea of like, yeah, I can like through CBT say I'm probably not a bad person, quote unquote, but I don't feel that way. Someone who would benefit from seeing the world or their self in new ways. This is maybe everybody in a way, but just to kind of name this like more specifically, like someone who's going through an existential crisis and doesn't quite understand like where their place in life is anymore. Or maybe so they view themselves as really isolated and are rigid in that viewpoint. Maybe they're having difficulty with forgiveness or letting go of a certain emotion. And we also want to consider someone's a more likely ideal candidate for this if they have some sort of support externally and also inner resources to help withstand the shakeup and the disorientation of a journey session. So, do they have community support, ego strength, sense of self, reality testing, a grounded belief system in some ways? I do like this quote of you have to be somebody before you can become nobody. So this idea of like there should be something substantial here that we're kind of like working from as a foundation, even if we're exploring with a lot of curiosity and a person's looking toward making a lot of changes. Often I've heard educators in this field not recommend this treatment for people under the age of 25. So legally, someone has to be at least 21, but sometimes people will say like, ah, you're really kind of discovering and identifying yourself up until around that age, typically in life. And it can be really more disorienting to have this kind of shakeup rather than something that's going to be supportive.
Another thing I realized we didn't have on here, also pregnant or breastfeeding.
Oh,
The
yes.
rule out.
Yes.
There's some debate on both breastfeeding about the
Yeah.
idea of kind of like the pump and dump thing.
Yeah, for like 3 days
yeah,
after
we
or
have to be
so.
really, really careful around
Yeah.
navigating that.
Yeah, glad you brought that up. So some rule outs. So these are actually state-based. So I'm not saying this from my personal therapeutic viewpoints, but rather like these are actually outlined in the forms that are completed in that intake process and that preparation process. So Oregon actually has most of these listed as rule outs. Colorado uses the language to proceed with extreme caution. So personal or family history of psychosis, this is often seen as a rule out because there's an increased likelihood of instigating a psychotic episode if someone has this history. Present suicidal ideation or kind of like a generalized instability within their life. Bipolar 1 disorder, especially lithium use, there's a really high likelihood if someone is actively on lithium and takes psilocybin that they may have a stroke or other medical emergencies. Under 21 years old, as a rule out, active substance use disorder with use in the past 30 days. This one is kind of tricky because psilocybin can be so helpful for people who are experiencing a substance use disorder. And also, if someone is coming in and they have, they're still actively getting high, they're still actively using substances, there's less likelihood of this treatment being helpful for them rather than just sort of like further disorienting or kind of fitting into a larger pattern of experiencing altered states. So there's usually like a minimum expectation of about 30 days of abstinence. Sometimes people want to see that for 2 months, just to really have it like that, again, going back to like a foundation or a grounding to be moving from. And also certain physical medical conditions. So psilocybin is activating. I've often heard medical professionals say like someone should be healthy enough to climb several flights of stairs. So if someone has like a heart condition, blood pressure condition, certain other medical conditions do serve as rule outs. Often these are being like kind of flagged at that preparation stage, and there are medical professionals who will provide sort of like screening and some recommendations around whether someone is sort of safe to engage in this treatment or not. If we need to kind of boil this down, the main question I had to ask is, can this person tolerate a destabilization? Do they have enough intact ego to tolerate dismantling it for a period of time? So I do want to actually kind of name specifically for people exhibiting behaviors consistent with BPD. There's likely a high need of support, and you will see like borderline personality disorder diagnosis is not as explicit rule out here. So just something that we need to kind of consider, like, are they already engaging in treatment? Like, are they kind of somewhat far along in DBT or another treatment? And can they have some level of stabilization that they're showing? And I highlight may need to taper off SSRIs. This is very much kind of the Wild West. And
Well, there's a lot of like, so I'll say that like traditionally in like the research, they initially required all participants to taper off of their SSRIs, somewhat for, looking at like what is like, the treatment effects and like what's, leading to treatment outcomes. But also there was a theoretical worry about the potential of serotonin syndrome because psilocybin acts on the serotonin system. However, more research has suggested that is very, very unlikely. There are some views that SSRI use could potentially blunt or block the journey experience. So for some people, there might be of like, okay, do you do a higher dosage? Do you, taper off? We're seeing more and more now that like, these treatments are rolling out more and like, not in non research settings that sometimes like the SSRIs don't blunt the experience at all. So sometimes like there can be a higher risk for like how long people have been on the medications compared to if they've been on them for a shorter period of time. Also with this is like what they have found is that if you attempt to taper off of your SSRIs and are having difficulty doing so, it is much better for you to get back on your SSRI for doing the administration session rather than powering through. If you are having difficulty tapering, you are more likely to have a difficult experience and like more negative outcomes compared to having the experience with the SSRIs on.
yeah. And anecdotally, we're hearing so many varying recommendations and experiences of some people being told you need to taper off your SSRIs for 6 months. Some people saying like you need to just taper down for the couple days before. Some people coming in and being told don't taper off, just do a higher dosage. So again, we don't really, there's not, unfortunately, not an established uniform procedure of what should happen here. But this is something that we may need to consider based on a physician's recommendation. Again, this is where partnering or having lots of healing centers will have like contracted medical providers who can kind of help give some guidelines around these types of things. So to lay this out very specifically in blue and white here, do provide information about clinical research. Anything educational that we've shared with you today is welcome to be shared with your clients. Like you can discuss the default mode network. You can discuss it in these metaphorical terms. Something that we often bring up in conversation is like, our existing baseline is that our brain kind of operates very efficiently, almost the same way that water runs down a mountain and creates a rut. And the more time that water has been running in a specific stream, the deeper that rut is going to be. And that's where we have that rigid thinking. With psilocybin, there's this opportunity. Sometimes I've heard it's the analogous, help me with the word, analogy. Yes. Of like, imagine that same landscape, but after a really big snowfall and everything is flat and there's opportunities to create new patterns and new paths down the mountain.
Yes, it's like, okay, like that, like that there's like, you're walking on these paths and now there's like a new potential path. You still have to walk it. You're going to have to like wear that like new path down, but at least now you see it exist.
You are allowed to say nothing clearly disqualifies you based on the exclusion criteria. You can say it's not FDA approved, and you can refer, kind of best practice is to refer to multiple facilitators, directory. Do not recommend this treatment and do not provide clearance or green light to say like you are good to go. That is not the role of clinicians within this.
A couple things I want to make sure to highlight here, because yeah, this question has come up and I've mentioned a few times of challenging experiences. I'll say like there are some facilitators who have this view of like there is no such thing as a bad trip. I also found that to be quite invalidating language for some individuals who would classify their experience as a bad trip. The research does suggest that the chances of challenging experiences or bad trips are reduced with appropriate set and setting, with like tested, like mushrooms, things like that, but they can occur. Some of the things that, can come up around this can be extreme anxiety, loss of sense of like reality that can be very, very scary and difficult to kind of like ground back into.
And risk for those increase with dosage in the research.
Yeah. So that's again for sometimes when people are like, nope, just shoot me out there. Being able to be like, okay, maybe you don't always have to go that far out to still have like things be really beneficial. Intense physiological reactions of, like heart rate racing, body releasing, nausea, things like that. There can have that potential of worsening symptoms after these experiences. Again, we're shaking things up. We can't guarantee particular outcomes. Life disruption, having these like large insights, like we were talking about, of not making these large changes 2 weeks after, but there might be some insights that could lead to life disruption. And, that some people potentially questioning the idea, I think broadly speaking, this idea of like recovered memories and traumas, is like an area of, a lot of like debate within this field and, has that potential within this work as well. HPPD, so hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. So these are perceptual disturbances that continue or recur kind of after the acute effects have ended, can last for months. This is, the research suggests it is very rare, and in particular in these structured settings that it is very rare, but it can happen. And so, like referring to specialists in those circumstances. We already talked about the SSRI challenges. Medication interactions, I realized that, we didn't talk, I meant to mention it earlier. A lot of the time within this work, we might refer out to a physician to, again, get really specific clearance on their medications. There might be certain things of, you can take this as you regularly do this one, we want you to taper off this one whole day so we do have doctors who, they can be able to have a meeting with who can go over those types of things or any other kind of like health concerns. Some other just kind of interesting medication interactions, trazodone for like kind of common medications, trazodone. There's some view that it totally blunts the experience. Other people, that's not their experience. And GLP-1s, interestingly, has been shown to drastically delay the onset of the effects, which can be a real problem. If the effects are coming on 7 hours later, you think you didn't have an experience, and then it kicks on once you're headed home. So there could be a need to taper and hold GLPs for a period of time. And underreporting rule outs, this is just something for, again, of talking about this idea of like, for some people, this feels like this is the thing I need. This is the thing that, will help me. And if they have a rule out and worrying about like not being able to access these services, and we have a really limited amount of time to get to know these clients. So this is a great place where, getting referrals from therapists who know their clients is really great, to where we can have a bit more of that history, because in this, unfortunately, we're often having only a couple of sessions before engaging in this work. I wish I had like more time to go into some of those unfortunate historical abuses that have happened. They unfortunately have happened in this field, not only in the underground, but in research. People are in very vulnerable states under these circumstances, and unfortunately that has not always been respected, and abuses have occurred. So ensuring that your clients are engaging in this work with safe people and in safe circumstances.
We've got some game time decisions coming about what to use this last
We're gonna run out of time. We have a lot that we wanted to talk about. I think we've gotten through most of it.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have to skip the case study, unfortunately, unless.
No, I would 1 minute.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we were told if we go over time that she will record it, and then you'll have access to the recording.
Okay, so let's just proceed as usual. Hang out if you've got a 12 o'clock that you need to run to. You'll have access to this. Thank you for being here. If you need to leave,
and please contact us with additional questions.
Absolutely. Okay, let's roll on.
Oh, that's me. Okay, so what is my role as primary therapist if I refer to Pat? I've had this question come up sometimes of like, okay, am I just totally referring out and now they're your client? So this is typically very time limited, very focused treatment that we are only providing these like limited, sessions. I have had some clients who aren't set up with a therapist who continue on, like working with me after. But traditionally, we would view like you are the primary therapist who are, referring to us just for these, set number of sessions, and then referring back to you. And you can be a part of, this idea of like prep and integration, of the preparation again within this is mindfulness exercises, EMDR, IFS work, ACT-based principles. Like those are all like wonderful like aspects of preparation. So your therapy can be a really, really powerful tool. I find that clients who are in therapy and have talked about this like with their therapist come in very prepared to be able to like really kind of like, have some positive outcomes and benefits. And then again, if that continued integration forward, what are these insights and how do we continue to process these? How do we continue to make meaning and translate this into your life? And when I say outside and within formal PAC, I've also had some clients where they ask, like, can my therapist actually be in our prep sessions, be in our integration sessions? You are technically, like, if you are in Colorado, like, or, like here, like you are allowed to be in the administration session as that extra support. We'd want to talk with you about, again, what's your role, having that non-directive stance. But if that feels safer for the clients, to have that support, like, that is absolutely possible. So we really want, therapists to be as involved as possible to be able to help clients get the most out of these treatments. Okay, a lot of these we've talked about. Some of the controversies, access and equity. Again, it's just really high cost, limited availability right now, in only a couple of states. Even within the states where it is available, not as available in rural regions. We're hoping that, there can be greater access and equity. That's some of the hope with like the FDA approval is, opening up access for like more insurance coverage, things like that. The commercialization, when there's money in something, unfortunately, venture capital gets interested, commercialization gets interested. So I think that also is something of, again, even within some like healing centers, being able to kind of gauge of, okay, does this seem like a money-making operation? versus, focused on healing. Cultural appropriation, within indigenous medicine. So here I mentioned like in particular, like ayahuasca. Again, there is this interesting like aspect of that, like, these mushrooms do grow on every continent. Like every culture has like some degree of kind of like relationship like with this medicine. But looking at the aspect of like the practices that you're utilizing, we're in this interesting balance of trying not to become too clinical and too westernized within these approaches, while also not co-opting and appropriating, some of like the traditions within this, and how do we blend and take like the wisdom of these traditions in a way that is respectful, and not co-opting it. Again, concerns around therapist misconduct, abuse of vulnerable states. Yeah, I'm just, again, unfortunately, like within these, there's a huge aspect too of, again, for that idea of letting go of that ego. Big changes can happen in some of these circumstances, and sometimes the client can want to kind of project that onto you of like, you did this for me, and really letting go of that ego and trying to like check in with yourself around these like hierarchical situations, and the potential of like these individuals are in very vulnerable states, and being very aware of like boundaries within these situations. And yeah, just informed consent, set and setting, boundaries, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of integration. I always tell people, I will say like one of the tricky parts, like, where like in the informed consent, we tell people that, like you're allowed to like end services at any time. And I always say like with the caveat where I'm like, technically after you do the administration session, I can't force you to attend the integration session. But saying like, I am asking, like we know that the integration is an important and essential component of having this be effective. So I am asking respectfully that like you agree that if you complete the administration session, that you will attend the integration session.
There's a lot of trust and agreements. Even during the administration session, we're making agreements of like, we do not leave the building, and other things that we were just really kind of through kind of a social contract holding. For time-wise, just to let you know, we're going to go over a case study, and this is sort of our last slide just before we make a couple other announcements. So just want to orient people to where we are. We'll spend just a couple minutes on this case study, and then we'll close it up.
So this case study, we did feel like it could be, powerful to not do as much of kind of an amalgamation, but have a true case study. This was a client who I did work with who did give permission for to be used in a case study. He's an individual who had expressed really wanting to get the word out on these treatments, but not really knowing how. So when he like heard that I was like doing this presentation, he very generously offered to use his treatment experience as a case study. So this client is a Caucasian heterosexual cisgender male in his 40s, a former EMT of 25 years who's experiencing PTSD from various workplace trauma exposures, primarily coming in to address alcohol use disorder with alcohol being his primary means of coping. And his intention was to let go and let the light in. For kind of some context, he was reporting that he had been drinking the equivalent of 6 beers a day for a long period of time, which had increased in recent months, following recent stressors to the equivalent of 12 beers and a fifth of vodka per day. He did meet with a physician who consulted on a safe taper of alcohol leading up to the administration session. So I'm just going to kind of read through like some of like the notes from the session of some of like his experience. So as the medicine came on, he began speaking about a visual where he was taking various memories of his life and putting them into bags and chucking them off the side of a ship, and was just saying, there's so much to say goodbye to. I feel like I'm letting go of an entire life, and I just hope everybody's okay. He then discussed a near-death experience while working as an EMT, and how it was related to accepting a lack of control in times when he had several moments in his life where he believed that he was going to die, and he had accepted, like, this is the moment where I'm going to die. And he said, like, and then I opened my eyes and I'm still here, and really trying to reconcile with that experience. He chose to take a booster dose in order to go deeper into his processing. After taking that booster dose, he was encouraged to put on his eye shade, We placed a weighted blanket over him and encouraged him to turn more inward. At that time, he did move more toward internal processing, was engaging less for about an hour. Later during integration, he described that during that time, he did feel as though he experienced a death and a rebirth experience, and other themes really related to like meaning of around death, as well as his relationship with his girlfriend. When he emerged out of that internal processing, he sat up and he said, "It's like I'm using my eyes for the first time. I always knew this place was here, but I didn't know how to find it." And throughout the remainder of the session, he really balanced kind of this internal reflection with sharing with me, and themes kind of included this idea of just being like, oh, like this, like I knew this place was here and I just wish I could help others see this. I wish I could share this experience. I knew this was within me. And also wanting to let go of external pressures. He kept just saying like, it's all bullshit of like certain like aspects. If we can realize it's all bullshit and just kind of like let go of those pressures and focus on what matters most. And it also reflected on his fears of letting others see the real him, saying, that he had this fear of like deep down, I'm this bad person, and how that kind of keeps him from connecting to others, and how he really wanted to let go of those fears and move into connection. In the post-administration session, so at this point, he's about 2 months sober. He has reported significantly reduced frequency and intensity of urges to drink. He did say that, now the urges are like somewhat starting to come back, but he feels much more capable of noticing them without engaging. He feels much more hopeful and just confident in his ability to kind of navigate those urges. But again, this is where we're looking at, unfortunately, within this, I meant to mention how to, the first session, the first legal session in Colorado occurred in June of last year, the end of June. So we're still really fresh, again, within this regulated market, particularly in Colorado. A lot of clients are asking, like, how long are the effects? Like, how often are people coming back? And a lot of it right now is we don't know. He also is reporting greater intimacy, reduced arguments in his romantic relationship, a lot less irritability, and just greater connection. He talked a lot about increased motivation. So he's engaging in a lot more regular exercise, meditation. And he said I'm cleaning up my life literally and figuratively. So having a lot of motivation of like actually organizing things in his living environment, getting set up within like new job opportunities, creating routines in his life to be able to just be really like investing in himself, investing in his like health and well-being. But the biggest thing that he really reported was that he said the most significant shift is a massive change in how he views and feels toward death. And he described greater acceptance, and primarily with that, he reported significant reduction in just being triggered by memories from his job. That there were these particular memories, particular calls that he was on of these death experiences that he has just so much greater like acceptance and understanding and like compassion around that experience. And also within that shift in relationship with death, he stated that he has been able to be more present with a family member who is currently dying, whereas he said that he feels he would have been more avoidant in the past, but that he actually is able to engage in that relationship, be present with this family member in their death experience. So he does recognize and acknowledge, the need for additional work, and is wanting to, get set up with a therapist. There's actually a great group called Psychedelics in Recovery, which has like a lot of different in-person online groups for recovery support for individuals who utilize psychedelics as a part of their recovery. But he said that he feels more capable of engaging in further trauma processing and is feeling much more hopeful about his recovery going forward. Okay.
Lovely.
All right. Well, apologies for going over, but thank you all for joining us. And please reach out with additional questions, connections, any way we can give support.
Yeah, we appreciate your extra time here. Make it's apropos for discussing psychedelics, and we're all having a subjective experience of 2 hours, which is really 2 hours and 12 minutes here. So thank you. I do want to put a shout out to UCBT's next CE event with my colleague Matthew, Diagnostic Complexity, Assessing the Intersection of Autism and Personality Disorders. And also to note that UCBT is hiring program director for a trauma stress resilience clinical team leader and also an administrative position for a client care coordinator. So thank you, everybody. We look forward to hopefully hearing from you all downstream of hopefully this made an impact on you. And um, there's kind of this really like sacredness to like this is early on this is a new psychedelic movement and we all sort of need to tend to it in a way that this has been shut down before. There's has 50s and 60s were a time of research and then prohibition, and we really want to be careful and caring in this time, so we appreciate everyone's attendance here and can hopefully all together sort of nurture this larger movement.
Thank you.